to the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. I'm delighted to have you with us this evening. We hoped we could be in person, but here we are on Zoom. We are very fortunate to have with us a guest who's written a great new book. I am Bob Allison, the president of the Colonial Society, and our guest this evening is Dane Morrison. And Dane is a longtime member of the Colonial Society, also a longtime professor of early American history at Salem State University. He's also chaired the history department as well as coordinated the American Studies program at Salem State. And he's been president of the New England Historical Association and the New England Regional World History Association, and has been involved in a lot of other terrific history groups in New England, including, of course, the Colonial Society. And he is the author of a number of distinguished books, True Yankees on the South Seas and the Discovery of American Identity, and he being one of them. And he's here tonight to talk about his new book, which is Eastward of the Cape of Good Hope. And it's about Americans encountering the world east of the Cape of Good Hope. So, and it's a terrific book, and I'm really happy that Dane could be with us to talk about it. So welcome, Dane.
Thank you, Bob. How is can you see the screen?
We can see your screen, and now you're going to find the PowerPoint to take us east of the Cape of Good Hope on this chilly New England evening, and we'll...
Here we go. How's that?
Here we go, good.
So thank you everyone for coming. I especially want to thank Bob and Aunt Cesare and Mary, and the entire wonderful, wonderful Colonial Society of Massachusetts group for this opportunity. So I'll start by offering an overview of the book, and then a little bit on how the book came to be. And then we'll preview a chapter or two, depending on how much time we have. Today is a serendipitous but resonant date for our chat. Let's see if I can find this one. There we go. I have to just move some things around here. There we go. And the opening lines of the book reveal a serendipity from the Hampshire Federalist, 4th of November, 1806. So we're in the autumn of 1806, and American newspapers were filled with the horrific news of the loss of the ship Essex. Now, this was not the famous ill-fated bark that had been stove by a whale in 1820 and was later transformed into an American icon through the pen of Herman Melville. Although the reports of this Essex, a merchant ship out of Salem, were in fact as lurid and as terrifying. So I'm going to read from the Hampshire Federalist. News is received here that Captain Joseph Orne in the ship Essex had arrived at Mocha. This is a port on the southeastern tip of Arabia, with $60,000 to purchase coffee, and that Mahomet Eichel, commander of an armed ship, persuaded him to trade at Hadida and to take on board 30 of his Arabs to help navigate her there while his vessel kept her company. The Essex sailed in company with the pirate ship. Night approached, but alas, not one of the unfortunate crew were fated to behold their country again or the light of another day. At a given signal, the pirates on board fell upon the crew with their knives. The corsair ranged alongside, and in a few minutes, not an American was left to tell the tale of their destruction. The headless body of the captain and mutilated carcass of the Englishman floated on shore, and being recognized, received the rites of burial in a far distant land. The Essex was plundered and burned. What I thought important in this story was not so much the slaughter, but rather the news of murdered Yankees that was carried across the seas and into American consciousness. The news from Arabia, as the news from Mexico that we all know from Richard Caton Woodville's 1884 painting, was as shocking. And the book explains its significance in this way. It would have been difficult for Americans in the early republic to escape this tragedy and the thousands of similar reports from around the globe that depicted the world beyond their shores in such dire terms. News of similar assaults on their countrymen aboard the Boston off Nootka Sound in 1803, the Putnam in 1805, and the Friendship off Sumatra in 1831. The murders of the men of the US exploring expedition in the South Seas in the 1830s, the loss of explorers such as Joseph Ingraham and Isaac Pendleton, and the mysterious disappearance of the US Navy sloop Wasp in 1814, and the loss of travelers such as Samuel Shaw and William Henry Lowe to tropical fever. All of this assaulted American readers. So the book asks a central question, and I think Elijah Gould captured it perfectly in a blurb he wrote for the book. When did Americans learn to fear the world beyond their shores? And where and how did they decide that the proper response was force? The book continues, even before stepping onto a global stage in the 1780s, Americans had imagined the world as disordered and dangerous, deranged by tyranny or steeped in chaos, often deadly, always uncertain, unpredictable, and unstable. And their encounters after independence reinforced their assumptions. So to develop the argument, the book moves through 6 chapters. From chapter 1, imagining the global vision of one colonial American, Nicholas Boylston, then through chapters on the ways in which American travelers describe the Ottoman Empire, China, India, and what they called the Great South Sea, that expanse of water from really from the Cape of Good Hope all the way through the northwestern coast of America. It's a term they used. And then finally into a concluding chapter called Echoes, which surveys how this discourse continues to influence our understanding of the world and into our own times. So that's an overview of the book. As you all know from your own writing, every book has a story of its own. And briefly, this book came out of pieces left on the cutting room floor of the last book. In researching True Yankees, I read a lot of ship's logs, journals, diaries. I read a lot of newspaper clippings and so on. Right throughout all of that, all of these sources, I found themes of national identity. And so I wrote about how mariners celebrated their voyages as national achievements. I was not so much writing a conventional celebratory tale. I wasn't interested in that. I was interested in recapturing their voices. So I was writing about how they celebrated their voyages. But at the same time, there was a strong undercurrent in the evidence that told a different and darker story. I found a language of anxiety and apprehension, a discourse of fear, fatalities, and loss. And I wanted to tell that story too. So all of that is incorporated into this book. It's kind of a dark counterpoint to True Yankees. I really need to make a nod to a number of scholars here. As the project evolved, I came across brilliant work by so many scholars, young and old, who influenced my thinking. And I wish I could talk about all of them, but I can highlight only a few tonight. Bronwyn Douglas, an Australian, I believe, historian of Pacific encounters, calls on historians to try to capture the immediacy of encounter. Maria Fuentes, Dispossessed Lives, I love all of these works, observes that the selective nature of collecting papers in an archive privileges one point of view and prevents us from gaining a balanced and authentic sense of early American encounters in the East unless we read creatively. And I don't mean we make stuff up, but we read imaginatively. I love the work of Rebecca Solnit, of the marvelous Lisa Lowe, of course, Michel Rolfe Trujillo, I never pronounce his name correctly, who have probed the discourse of colonial archives, have been especially penetrating in explaining the problem of absences and silences. And Natalie Molina, I love her concept of racial scripts. We'll talk about that later. And of course, Emily Conroy Krutz, whose work on American missionaries enlightens my understanding of the evangelical nature of American travelogues, even those written by non-religious people. So chapter 1, we start with an image that I think is familiar to just about everybody here tonight. I'm going to spend some time on the first chapter in particular, because I think this one might be of particular audience interest to the audience of the Colonial Society. I called it Coffee House Chatter, and it examines the print and material culture that brought a global consciousness to the British American colonies. I borrowed from a favorite chapter of mine, The Web of Seaport Life, from Gary Nash's wonderful book, The Urban Crucible. And so the first chapter has us spending a day vicariously with Nicholas Boylston in coffee houses and counting houses and on the wharves and streets of Boston. The chapter opens describing the several Copley paintings at the Museum of Fine Arts and Harvard University. And I write, true to his reputation for extravagant living, Boylston, in Copley's painting, is sumptuously adorned in a sea of Chinese silk, a voluminous Indian banyan or dressing gown, woven of lustrous silk damask and capped with an Arabian-style tam or turban. And Copley's study of Nicholas Boylston conforms to similar portraits that he painted of Boylston's younger brother, Thomas, a la Turk, and sister Rebecca Boylston Gill, similarly adorned in a Turkish-style costume distinguished by gold embroidery, a silk turban laced with pearls, and a rose-colored mantle draped across one arm. I've been intrigued by the Boylston paintings for longer than I can remember, and have wondered, what do they tell us about the global consciousness of British Americans on the edge of empire, on the peripheries of a world that they called civilized? What we do know is that colonial Americans were participants in an early modern Orientalist fantasy known as turquoiserie, an aesthetic fascination with the Ottoman Empire. Others similarly employed the discourse and fashions of chinoiserie, embracing the ways of their own imagined China. So we follow Boylston to a coffee house, obviously not this one. This is the London Coffee House in England, a painting from 1668. But it's a Turkish institution. It's established in these coffee houses are established in Turkey in the early, I believe, 17th century, and they spread to London by the mid 17th century, and from there to the colonies. And one has the sense that colonists like Boylston were aware, if only tangentially, were aware of the provenance of coffee houses, and indeed enjoyed knowing or having that knowledge. Here He would find pleasant conversation and newspaper reading amidst the coffees, teas, and cocoa, the cinnamon, nutmeg, and other spices brought by global trade to the provinces. And he might easily have felt a camaraderie with the author of a piece printed in the Boston Newsletter, October 1727, that read, "I have observed in all the companies I have been in, from the Caravan Lodge in China to the Crown Coffee House upon the Long Wharf, that all conversation is built upon equality. Title and distinction must be laid aside in order to talk and act socially." Not sure that Boylston would have laid his distinctions aside all that easily, but I do think that he enjoyed the genteel fantasy that global commerce and global conversation brought him. Boylston's Boston, then, was a domain of global penetration. As boys growing up in a seaport linked, if indirectly, to Smyrna, Calcutta, and Canton, Thomas and Nicholas' consciousness was bathed in the fashions and fancies of the wider world. A global sensibility intruded into their lives in essays like this one from Boston's weekly rehearsal for February 1732. Look around at the habitable world, not to mention those countries remote and little known. The crowded Christian countries point out Rome. The spacious Ottoman Empire turned their eyes to Mecca, and the Chinese to the school of Confucius. Every people have a name peculiar to themselves, whom all the world, they say, are bound to worship. So there's a kind of spirit of tolerance, of toleration. One can imagine oneself as in Goldsmith's term, a citizen of the world. But as the rest of the chapter points out, that's a rather darker world than this conversation suggests. In bookshops, subscription libraries, personal libraries, and newsprint, the global consciousness of a Nicholas Boylston would have been complemented by a plethora of travel logs and geographies. We could expect to find in a gentleman's study or a lending library, Moore's travels into the inland parts of Africa, or Anson's voyage to the South Seas and many parts of the world, Marana's letters written by a Turkish spy, John Harris's travels and voyages throughout the world, Father Jartu's travels of the Jesuits in China and Tartary, Wood's The Ruins of Athens, Baalbek, and Palmyra. All of these were advertised in the bookshops, and all were available. Were they all read? Were they all read deeply? I have no way of knowing, and I look forward to reading about readership from other scholars, but we know they were available. A perusal of newspapers likewise reveal a fascination with travelogues. We see a sample in Isaiah Thomas's Massachusetts Spy, an advertisement for the Journal of Captain Cook's Last Voyage by the American John Ledyard, the Algerine Spy in Pennsylvania, Gulliver Revived, and so on. But as I said, there's a darker story here, and beneath the surface of Nicholas Boylston's placid expression in Copley's painting lay a world of worry. Let's recall that Cook was killed, was murdered, was butchered on that last voyage. In these treatments, in these books, mariners starved and suffered. They were killed in typhoons, butchered by indigenous peoples, captured by pirates. They died from diseases and drowned in floods. The dangers of this wider world were magnified in sensationalist newsprint. And we see this kind of thing, which is common if you look for it. We see this in a report from the Pennsylvania Packet of May 1785. A faithful translation of Al-Qurashi ibn Khalid, lord of the Algerine territories in Ocean, or maybe not. So he presented himself. Whereas the strength of our arms, the ferocity of our character, and the nature of our religion have long continued a general hostility on our part against all those Christian powers who do not lay down to the dust before our throne and alleviate our wrath by rich and judicious presents. And whereas certain inhabitants of a place lately the abode of much more respectable animals than themselves, to wit, North America, having withdrawn themselves from a subjection to their masters, merely as mild as that we will suffer, merely as mild as that we inflict on our slaves, they have not yet submitted to our prerogative, wherefore we are proposed to loose our corsairs upon them. And whereas we have received certain information of the riches and abilities in said country, particularly the city of Philadelphia, what he proposes is invasion. That the Ottoman Empire is poised in March 1787 at a time when the new republic is aborning and vulnerable. He's proposing invasion. I'm going to skip this one and go on because the next part I think is really fun. Although Nicholas Boylston's mansion house no longer stands on Beacon Hill, it is likely that a personal library graced the first floor, perhaps wainscoted in mahogany with turkey carpets and adorned with maps that brought him the Great South Sea, the Pacific Ocean, the Western Ocean, Afrique, and India. In cartouches, an accumulation of images would have populated Boylston's view of the world, figuring a menagerie of exotic goods and savage peoples. I think the cartouche of a map is of particular salience here, revealing the conventional emblems thought to represent each part of the globe. Here, this may be familiar to most people here. Henry Popple's 1733 Map of the British Empire in America typified these provocative images, a pastiche of both profit and peril. This cartouche set the Great South Sea against three imagined Indians dressed only in loincloths and featured headdresses, each carrying a quiver of arrows. At the top, juxtaposed against two monkeys, a parrot, and palm trees, one bare-breasted native woman caresses a child, and she's sitting atop a crocodile or alligator, one foot resting on the severed head of a European man, an arrow embedded in his forehead. So, but in the lower corner, profit. You see European merchants, maybe Popple could even imagine maybe American merchants exploiting the riches of the East. I'm going to move this here. I'm just trying to move my cursor. In the same year, and likewise to be found in merchants' libraries or maybe even on tavern walls for generations after, was printed the Peninsula Indiae Citra Gangam, guiding the mind's eye to a distinctly Western impression of the dangers and opportunities of the Indian subcontinent. And here is the cartouche in detail. Boylston's eye might have settled on the cartouche, which featured astride a magnificent elephant, the animal draped in an exquisite rug, an imagined Indian pasha, sword in hand. What appeared to be African and European traders dressed in the striped costumes of the region, and their slaves, clad only in loincloth, lay around a cornucopia of goods, a chest of gold, ivory tusks, and a repast of foods and spices. The diversity of peoples in this image might look exotic, inviting to our eyes today. But I suggest that the same diversity could have been disturbing to the British American mind. We see in another map the western coast of Africa from Cape Blanco to Cape Verga. This is a 1789 map of Senegambia. And you see again some conventional tropes here. An African man dressed in loincloth, which was the ubiquitous trope that signified a backward civilization. He is seated astride a very angry looking lion, surrounded by a disordered menagerie of exotic creatures, an ostrich, a camel, a cobra, and a lizard. The pyramid in the background recalls Egypt and suggests the ancient civilization had followed into decadence and disorder. The news from the East made its way into the material culture of Boylston's world as well, amidst the porcelains and teas and rugs of the elite, and even down to the commoners. Here, I love this one. We see a prosaic powder horn on display at historic Deerfield that had been used in the French and Indian War. And what's hard to make out, and I apologize for the glare, but what's hard to make out is that this is a war canoe filled with warriors and on a voyage of war. But the image engraved on the powder horn was actually taken from something printed in the Gentleman's Magazine, published out of London. Let me see, I didn't write down the date, but it looks like, 1750, what is that? 1773, something like that. So here's the original image that was printed in the Gentleman's Magazine. Somebody found it and carved it on his powder horn and took that into battle in the French and Indian War. So what this suggests to us again is that there's a global consciousness, and that consciousness is not all glossy and friendly and tolerant. So I think we have time to discuss one more chapter. Yes, Bob? So we have a representative chapter on American encounters in Turkey. And I refer, in the title of the chapter, I refer to an incident from the 1760s in Cambridge, in which students had spurned the rancid butter that the university cafeteria offered them and engaged in a riot. And this was described as a Turkish tyranny. And the term was intriguing because Turkish tyranny or terrible Turk were terms that were very much part of the colonial parlance, even before the revolution. So the border into the Ottoman Empire for American voyagers stood at the entrance to the Mediterranean Sea from its Atlantic side. Poised like a sentry was the Rock of Gibraltar. For mariners and merchants of the new nation, Gibraltar marked the border, not just geographically, but a cultural border between Orient and Occident, order and mayhem, civilization and the other. The natural features of the Mediterranean characterized this liminal transition. Yankee mariners left behind notorious accounts of shipwreck along the coasts of North Africa and Arabia, where treacherous shoals and sunken rocks claimed many US vessels. Lighthouses were rare, and even approaching a coastline increased a crew's anxiety. In the reports of American travelers then, This was a dangerous land. Even the waters around it were treacherous. Prominent was piracy, and the Essex Massacre was just one example of hundreds of pirate assaults. I'm not going to spend much time on this slide here. I think we are all familiar with the Barbary Wars. I know our moderator is. And if you've not read The Pioneering Crescent Obscured, I recommend the book highly. I can't tell you how, I cannot say how important this has been on my thinking. So thank you, Bob.
Well, you're free to tell us how important it is.
We'll save that for the Q&A. Just how important was the book? The harbor of Alexandria, Egypt was the next stop. Once famed as the greatest harbor in the world, one of the 7 wonders of the world, in Yankee travelogues, Alexandria becomes a wasteland, becomes decayed. Ottoman rulers, attentive to their own pleasures, had long allowed it to fall into disrepair. Writing to Thomas Jefferson, the Dartmouth College dropout John Ledyard scathed, Alexandria at large forms a scene wretched and interesting beyond any other that I have seen. Poverty, rape, murder, tumult, blind bigotry, cruel persecution, pestilence, all live there. What Ledyard witnessed, what he sent back to the new nation, served as a warning that states rise and fall, and citizens must remain ever vigilant against tyranny, no matter how distant it was always a threat. For explorer and adventurer John L. Stevens, Alexandria represented the Ottomans' failure to build upon the achievements of the classical world. His 1836 travelogue, Incidents of Travel in Egypt, Arabia, Petraea, and the Holy Land, became a bestseller with multiple reprintings and would reinforce the impression of the Ottoman world as a dangerous, decayed land. Drawing upon the trope of Turkish tyranny, Stevens mused about its once splendid lighthouse and wrote, "In regard to the time in which it was made, it certainly is an extraordinary work, and it could only have been done in that time, in such a country as Egypt, where the government is an absolute despotism and the will of one man is the supreme law." So even the achievements of the Ottoman Empire are called into question. Others documented the spiritual and physical impoverishment of a people who lived under the tyranny of Ottoman rule. The work of Emily Conroy Krutz and Christine Herman helped me to frame the 1821 sojourn of 2 missionaries, Pliny Fisk and Levi Parsons. Time and again, their journey would encounter signs of destitution and decadence that they saw in Ottoman life. Common to their journals were entries such as, we found difficulty in even procuring a lodging. At length, we put up in a hut occupied by a Turk. It was dark, only about 10 feet square, the walls of earth, the roof of bushes and poles covered with soil and grass growing on it. There was neither chair nor table, bed nor floor in the habitation. Or another entry, the streets are narrow and very dirty, and the houses mean. You see no elegance and very little neatness. The thrust of this writing, contrasting the opulence of the pashas with the poverty and impoverishment of the common people, the thrust of this writing was not to foster empathy, but to raise a storm flag. If the Turk really did somehow conquer America and imposed Islam upon a Christian nation, a primitive existence might well be the future of the Republic, a kind of reversed manifest destiny. A related theme filled these travelogues. especially those who traveled deeper into the interior than the coast-clinging merchants. The tropes of cultural decline were documented in ruined temples and discarded artifacts, the remnants of historic and sacred places. For John Stephens, the Ottoman realm was one of the faded and worn out kingdoms of the old world. Missionary Pliny Fisk had read that the Ottoman rule had left the significant sites of the Holy Land in decrepit condition. And his itinerary confirmed the worst in entries such as, on our left hand, near the road, the ruins of a town, which we concluded must have been the ancient Marina. The missionaries struggled to locate significant sites of the Holy Land, and instead they could only approximate where these sites might have been. Along the seashore, Pliny Fisk reported, Strabo speaks of Marina as situated here or not far distant, and some maps insert the name in this place. Closer inspection brought no further satisfaction, and Fisk lamented the decay. He wrote, many pillars of granite, 8 or 10 feet long and 1.5 feet thick, and some fragments of marble were scattered on the ground. Among them, a statue of white marble. The arms and part of the head are gone. The body about 6 feet long and 3 thick. Once, perhaps, it was an object of worship. Now it lies entirely neglected, as we trust all relics of idolatry will be at some future day. Another danger, another trope in these accounts was that of the terrible Turk personified by sultans and pashas. Throughout this period, mariners, merchants, missionaries, and others depicted the Muslim world as the site of a Turkish tyranny, supine, flaccid, enervated. And yet, for all their power, the Ottoman leaders could not maintain order in the empire. Revolts from within fractured the stability of their rule. And beginning with the earliest newspapers, British Americans read of rebellions and revolts, and this continued into the era of the early republic, painting the Ottoman East as a bedlam. I'm going to skip that one. And the last trope for the Ottoman Empire, the fear of apostasy. The threat of capture by corsairs or marauders wasn't nearly as bad as the possibility that they might lose their souls, that they might lose their faith and turn Turk. And you hear this expression, you read this expression, turn Turk, throughout the accounts over and over and over again. Whether through force or seduction, this instilled further anxiety into a voyage. Even before leaving Gibraltar in 1819, Pliny Fisk and his colleague met the notorious Bostonian apostate George Bethune English. English had turned Turk, and had taken the name Muhammad Vebu Effendi. He had served in the artillery of the Egyptian Pasha, along with another man, another American who had taken the name Khalil Aga. Yet another who turned Turk was a fellow named John Pearl, or John Paul. He was the sole survivor of that same 1806 massacre aboard the Salem ship Essex, with which we started. He was then living in Yemen with his Muslim wife and children when the American missionaries met him. Pearl had forgotten much of his English. And worse still, from their perspective, he had converted to Islam. In their sojourn, missionaries, merchants, explorers, adventurers would encounter more of these renegados, such as English and Pearl, and feared that there would be more conversions from their true faith. Let's see. When in 1839, the North American Review asserted that, quote, human life has little value and human faith fit still in Islamic societies, the literary magazine was making a claim with which few Americans would have quarreled. Narratives of cruel captivity, false prophets, Turkish tyrannies, plagues, and earthquakes filled bookshelves and libraries throughout the early republic and prepared the ground for such blanket claims. Yankee visitors continued to describe this imagined East, as had John Ledyard in 1785, a scene wretched beyond any other that I have ever seen before. So just to finish up, Chapter 3, Unfeeling Mandarins in Canton and Macau, shows how China too figured prominently in the American imagination, and that these impressions likewise flavored American ideas about the world at large. In Canton, there's a different set of dangers. You do have the usual dangers, the common dangers, the ordinary dangers of any voyage. But in China, the accounts emphasize something different. They describe China as a corrupt and backward and oppressive place, rife with bureaucratic regulations that you wouldn't find in the Ottoman Empire. The fear expressed here was a fear of losing not so much your soul, but losing profits. The magnitude, the quantity and magnitude of Chinese regulations ran up the cost of commerce to such a degree that an Elias Haskell Derby of Salem actually sent a couple of ships to China and then stopped sending them. The cost cut into his profits too much. Arbitrary and baffling regulations, something they knew firsthand from the Navigation Acts, were the main problem found in China, representing a different kind of danger. In India, a voyage brought its own particular dangers. In Chapter 4, Hindus and Fakirs in India relates, here Oriental tyranny was framed in more subtle hues in the economic disparities between the few who lived in opulence and luxury and the many who eked out bare subsistence in grinding poverty. Somehow the news Eastward of Good Hope implied encounters in the Indian Ocean could carry these contagions back to America. I'm not sure how they thought that would happen, but what is important is that they thought this and they reported this again and again and again. Chapter 5, Cannibal Isles, explores American encounters in the Great South Sea, that vast expanse of water that covered the earth from the Cape of Good Hope through the East Indies to America's northwest coast. And here the travelogues unfold yet another kind of peril. This news from the East brought accounts of savage peoples who delighted in barbaric ceremonies and cannibal rituals, lurking in tropical coves to pounce on unsuspecting voyages. The last chapter, let me see, there's the last chapter here somewhere. It's called Echoes. And it's called Echoes. And what it does is use Molina's idea of a racial script to note how the discourse that we find in these travelogues continued throughout the latter 19th century in policies, in books, in discourses, in plays and poetries, and indeed continue into our own day today. So that's the book. I hope if you read it, I hope you enjoy it. And if you find any problems with it, I hope you'll let me know. So thank you, Bob, so much. And thank you everyone for joining.
Well, thank you very much, Dane, for a very interesting discussion. I do recommend the book and also hope people will put some questions in the Q&A. And while they are getting started, I have one or two Well, to what extent was it true that this was a dangerous, backward world filled with corrupt regimes and arbitrary despotisms? And we can see a degree of exaggeration, but to what degree were they accurate depictions of this world?
They were accurate to a degree. But they tended to overlook the positive things that pashas did, that Chinese mandarins did, that Indian rajas did. An encounter overseas could be, and often was, simply a device for celebrating what they thought the United States had, and where they actually use these. I mean, I didn't get into it, but usually a paragraph on the miseries and dangers of China or India would be followed by a paragraph on the benefits, the virtues, the values of the early republic. And my point is that these travelogues were a device, very consciously used to celebrate their own nation, and you celebrate your own nation by criticizing other peoples.
Okay. Lee Blackstone has a very good question about kind of the other side of this. To what degree did these folks find the Americans they encountered to be dangerous, backward, et cetera? Do we have any evidence of that?
Oh God, that's such a wonderful, wonderful question. Yes, but I tended to find criticisms of other Americans in private letters, but not in publications. And where you find them in publications, the American villain's name is replaced with ellipses. So he's not named. And if I may give briefly a wonderful example. So there's a Captain Edmund Fanning from first Connecticut, then New York, and he's sailing in company with a Philadelphia ship through the Straits of Sumatra, Straits of Sumatra. And they round a point and they see a flotilla of 13 proas filled with pirates, 13 war canoes filled with pirates. And immediately the Philadelphia ship takes off. It sails faster than Fanning's Betsy. And the Philadelphia ship sails off and leaves him to face the pirates alone. And I mean, I would scream bloody murder, but Fanning, taking on the guise of the gentleman, simply replaces the fellow's name with ellipses. Now, I did a little bit of research on this, and I tracked the guy down, and I know who he is. So,
can you tell us?
Nope.
Or you don't want to hear. You're still the guise of the gentleman. You won't betray that confidence.
I'm going to respect Captain Fanning's wishes.
Okay, thank you. Jeff Perlman has a question about the role of the Salem merchants, Elias, Haskett, Derby, and so on, in trade with the Ottoman Empire and the other Salem merchants in the Ottoman Empire.
So Derby does most of his work after leaving China. He does most of his work in the Indian Ocean, and this becomes his sphere. He sends his son, Elias Haskett Jr., to India for 3 years, who makes a lot of money, also sells Derby's favorite ship, the Grand Turk, without telling Dad. But the Derby Empire makes a great deal of money in the Indian Ocean. He actually really operates between the Cape of Good Hope and the East Indies, makes a lot of money buying pepper, or having his captains buy pepper in Sumatra, makes a lot of money, Ile-de-France, Mauritius, and India, does not do business in slavery. Although he has 2 or 3 slaves, he warns his captains, do not engage in the slave trade. I hope that helps, Jeff.
Very interesting. Karima Lewis has a question, which is also on my mind, about the Americans who turned Turk. Has there been research on them? What more do we know about those who did turn Turk?
Not enough. We've got Emily Conroy Krutz. Christine Herman did a nice treatment. Her book is wonderful. Oh my God, I'm going to kick myself because I'm going to forget his name. There's a wonderful article by James Fichter. He wrote So Glorious a Prophet, wonderful book. He has just come out with an article, and I can try to look up the site and send it to people. He's done a wonderful book on Pearl.
Okay. We'll see if we can find it. We can send it out to the participants if they're good. And let's see, Anthony Guidoni, another good question, because there is this lure. I mean, but why do these guys emphasize the dangers so much? Was this to discourage others from venturing out and getting into the pepper trade? Or
I hadn't even considered that possibility. I think it was to sell books.
Yeah.
I think that's how you sold books. I think sensationalism in books sells as sensationalism in newspapers. And I think they wanted, I mean, they're sailors, so they want to spin a good yarn.
Yeah. No one's going to buy a book about your nice Caribbean cruise, but
No. Let's see if a book with a war canoe on its cover sells better than a book with a Yankee ship on its cover. But more seriously, there's a sense of authenticity here. They lived these lives. These were their experiences, and they lived. And once they lived, they wanted to tell the tale. They wanted people to know what the world was like. And they're not uniformly negative. Amasa Delano, Edmund Fanning, others, William Reynolds, they have complimentary things to say about people. There's a wonderful quotation from, I believe it was John Crowninshield in the 1790s. And he says he's in, I believe he's in Samoa or Guam, and he writes, who are the liars who make this stuff up about cannibals and savage people? These are, and I'm paraphrasing, obviously, these are the nicest people I've ever met. I've never met a people more honest. I've never met a people easier to do business with. And so I'm presenting sort of the one theme, sort of the dark side of things that they wrote about, because I think that actually shapes American consciousness today. I think I think Americans are afraid of some aspects of the world. And I wanted to find out, where did that fear come from? I mean, there's actually, I never imagined I would quote Donald Trump in any book or article, but there's a quote from Donald Trump saying simply, the world is a dangerous place. And he's using it to justify all kinds of intervention and mayhem. I have a lot of campaign flyers that I've saved in which that theme is repeated again and again and again. So I'm trying to understand what it is Americans think about the world, and I'm trying to understand where these ideas came from.
Do you see a difference in perception among, say, a merchant trader and a missionary? Are they about different things, or do they have a similar view of this world?
Not only do they see the world differently, but there's an antagonism between the two groups. They don't like each other. The merchants see the missionaries as troublemakers, as annoyances, people who will who will make the trade unstable. The missionaries despise the merchants for not doing enough, for being too materialistic, too much men of this world and not of the other. And so now, keep in mind, the merchants tended to stay right along the coast, right in the port cities, where things are rather more genteel, more ordered. There are more government services and so on. They write somewhat about the friendships they make, particularly merchants in places like India or China. They distinguish the ruffians along the wharf from the indigenous merchants, and there are some lovely friendships that are made between the Forbes family and Hao Qua in Canton, for instance, or merchants from Philadelphia, New York, and Salem with Indian merchants, and so on. For the missionaries, it's all up, they're collecting too.
Right.
They're trying to collect souls. And for them, every day is a failure. They have scant success in the Ottoman Empire, in China, in India. They have success, coerced success in the Pacific, but they don't come back with a record of success, and they're resentful. They didn't get enough help from the merchants.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, what are you working on now, Dane? Congratulations. I hate when, having done that, you've just finished this book and they say, so what are you doing now?
Oh, no, on the contrary. Thank you, Bob. What they say, the best thing you can ever say about a book is that it's done, it's over. As I mentioned, it's a 4-course load, so a month of grading. But my wife and I have been working on, off and on, a book. My wife, the wonderful Kimberly Alexander, and I have been working on a book on one family from Salem, the family of Nathaniel and Rebecca Kinsman. And in 1743, Nathaniel gets a job offer and to go to China, and they make a remarkable decision. They're going to go as a family. And so leaving 9-year-old Willie at home in private school, the family, and this includes, I think, one child who's 5 and one child who's on the way, they sail to China, to Canton. She has to stay in Macau because of Chinese regulations. She cannot go up to Canton with him. But she becomes kind of what does Laurel Thatcher Ulrich call it? Kind of a deputy husband. She calls herself the firm of Wetmore and Company in Macau, because she handles a lot of the business down there. And so it's a tragic story. It's a tragic story. Rebecca comes back with one child, and I won't say more about it than that, but it's a tragic story. But it's a remarkable story too, and we want to recover their voices and tell their story also.
Well, we will look forward to that story. Thank you for sharing this one, and thank you to Mary Blunt and Anne Cesare, who have helped to arrange this. And thank you, Dane. And I will encourage folks to get out and buy the book.
And I'll be happy to sign copies.
Great. Eastward of the Cape of Good Hope. So thank you. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.